Brian Laundrie cops slammed for not following him when he left home. Investigators with the small Florida police department that led the search for Brian Laundrie should have tailed him when they saw him leave home days before he was reported missing, an ex-detective says. Landrie's skeletal remains were found inside a swampy stretch of land in Myakkahatchee Creek Park on October 20, more than 5 weeks after the 23-year-old vanished from his parents' home in Northport on September 13. Brian Laundrie's remains were recovered from a Florida nature reserve on October 20. Credit, social media, refer to source. Police watched Brian leave the home on September. His disappearance came just 2 days after his fiance Gabby Petito, with whom he'd recently been on a cross-country road trip, was reported missing by her mother in New York. Investigators with the Northport Police Department watched Brian leave home in his silver Ford Mustang on Sept. 13. Through hidden cameras they'd secretly planted around the property. 2 days later, they thought they saw him return in the same car. They said he'd told them he was going hiking 4 days earlier, the day police watched him leave, in the nearby Carlton Reserve but never returned home. Police later realized that it was, in fact, Roberta Landrie, Brian's mother, who they had seen get out from the fugitive's Mustang on September. Officials said the fact she was wearing a baseball cap and is built similarly to Brian was the cause of the confusion. North Point Police Chief Todd Garrison put the mistake down to human error, calling it a common mishap in surveillance operations while insisting it had no significant impact on the outcome of the case. But a former NYPD homicide detective told The Sun that the misidentification amounts to incompetence, adding that police should have tailed Landrie when they saw him leave. Anything that Brian Laundrie would have been doing after he arrived at home would have probably been suspicious, the retired cop said, speaking on grounds of anonymity. He's not going to the local taqueria, and he's not going to the game room to play video games. Anything he's doing, this thing is probably working towards his defense and his protection. So if you're already doing surreptitious surveillance, why wouldn't you just follow them just to follow? So when you've got that first car and that car leaves on the 13th, why didn't you follow it? The retired cop said investigators could have either overtly or covertly followed Brian, explaining the advantages of each. It depends on what the objectives of the investigation are, because sometimes when you follow people covertly, sometimes they make a mistake and trip themselves up. And so sometimes you want to be overt so that under pressure, they do something stupid. I would have covertly followed him in the hope that he would go back to the body or dump evidence into a trash bin or go connect with somebody who's helping him through things. The ex-detective said surveillance operations can be difficult and it's not like TV. To comprehensively survey a suspect, investigators need a wealth of resources that may not have been available to Northport PD, he said. When you're really following somebody, you usually takes multiple cars to do it so that you're not detected, because let's face it, for you to stay close enough to somebody to be able to actually track where they've gone is not going to take long for somebody who's paying attention to figure out they're being followed, the cop said. So surveillances are really hardly any less you're willing to say so, since you want to follow people and you don't care if they know that you're following. The only legitimate excuse for that is to say, but we just didn't have the resources, so we're just tracking his comings and goings. The cop added that under no circumstances should they have presumed it was Brian that they saw return home on September. I'm sorry, but as a police officer, if I see a body get out of a car and walk into a house and it's got a hat on and it's kind of, protected, if I couldn't say 100% for sure that that was my subject. You can't just presume the operator of that car is Brian Laundrie, even though I can't really see him, I'm just going to assume it's him. That's so incompetent, he said. The Sun's source said while it's unclear how much of an impact the misidentification of Brian may have had on the case, it definitely impacted the outcome in some way. That's 2 days, 48 hours of work that just wasn't happening, he said, adding that they may have recovered crucial items of evidence near to where Brian's body was found that may have since been destroyed by the elements. During an event in Venice last Friday, Northport Police Chief Todd Garrison defended his officers over the mishap, putting it down to human error. By the time we became the lead agency, Brian had already left the house and presumably had already been deceased out in the Carlton Reserve, Garrison said. We are out there in the public for making a human error, the surveillance team told me. Chief Brian was seen going inside the house. Later on, we found out that Brian had left the house and now the parents on Friday wanted to report him missing, Garrison said. In fact, when my officers went out to the house to do the report with the FBI, I sat with the deputy chief in my office, hoping that they would find Brian hiding in a back bedroom, he said. Garrison said he stands by the efforts of the investigators who made the bizarre mistake. As a 30-year law enforcement veteran, doing surveillance, this is not uncommon, and if any expert out there says it is, they're lying to you, Garrison said. I can tell you one thing, the amount of work that was done, behind the scenes, 24 hours a day, from our team and the FBI team working on the second floor of the police department, was phenomenal work. That work led the search teams to locate Gabby Petito deceased, Garrison said. A cause, manner, and time of death for Brian is yet to be determined by investigators. A forensic pathologist is now investigating Brian's remains, which are believed to consist only of a partial human skull and bones. Brian and Gabby Petito had been on a cross-country road trip touring the U.S. national parks when Gabby vanished in late August, 2 weeks after the couple was involved in a domestic violence dispute in Moab, Utah. Brian has never been named a suspect in Gabby's death but is the sole person of interest in the case. He was also wanted on bank fraud charges after allegedly racking up $1,000 in charges on a credit card belonging to Gabby in the days after she was killed. An investigation into Brian's cause of death and Gabby's murder remains active and ongoing. Gabby was murdered during the couple's cross-country road trip. Credit, Instagram. Brian and Gabby had planned to tour the U.S. national parks for 4 months, but she was killed just over 2 months into their adventure. Credit, social media, refer to source.